It's time to embrace the crazed blood in E2M02 Crimson Chaos. I'm not a fan of this one. It seems more linear and forces you into damaging spikes. Probably the most creative thing about the map is the big fall you can make platforms to get back up. Other than that, it really isn't anything you haven't seen before. Platforms, jumps, and switches and things like that. Aesthetically, the red theme is nice, but the previous map also had that with more interesting design. Ultimately, it's not the worst, but it's uncreative and even somewhat irritating with the spikes. It's time to rattle into the caves in E2M03 Snaking Cavern. This one goes a bit back to the Pegasus and primate enemies of the past episode, but with the addition of twin-headed snakes to pelt you with projectiles. This one's alright for the most part. It's essentially a loop and you're pretty much required to go in one specific direction. This very much makes the map feel linear when it didn't need to be, and the pit in the middle leading down can be pretty easy to miss at first. This unfortunately means I don't have the most favorable opinion of the map since it doesn't feel the most rewarding to explore. Still, it's hardly the worst map out there and it's at least an engaging straight line. It's time to grow some cheese wings in E1M07 Lunar Pegasus. Despite having a new enemy and a pleasing lunar aesthetic, this might be the most underwhelming so far. The new enemy is flying with its projectiles dropping down like the devils, and the other two enemies are repeats. The only other notable part is the gauntlet of rapid fire at the end where the wizard finally starts acknowledging you. It's obviously not a bad map, though there's one spot meant to trap you in spikes if you don't do a combo switch beforehand. It just doesn't feel like there's as much new. It's still a solid map, just not quite as good as others before it. It's time to eat the forbidden fruit in E2M04 Sinister Serpentry. I'll be honest, I don't like the trend these maps are taking towards being more linear. Kinda defeats the purpose of a collectathon. Now mind you, this map actually has a new power-up in the form of a jump potion, so that's pretty cool. Other than that and one slight branching path though, it's another map that doesn't infuriate me, but rather leaves me wanting more. I prefer maps that give you a choice of paths to take so you can take them in any order you choose, not strongly compelling you down a certain way. At least the Pegasuses and twin-headed serpents still provide some challenge if nothing else. It's time to confront the big boss in E4M9, the Treacherous Trolodon. The map certainly wastes no time taking you into the deep end with Trolodon already on the attack, though he's a bit underwhelming. Other than teleporting around a few times, he's arguably even weaker than the monks in the first episode, only firing single fireballs. Kinda weird that Terexen, the good wizard, is still surprised you managed to win, given previous maps had him beginning to praise you. It had a nice way to end with an unobstructed view of the distant castle, but the boss itself just seemed too underwhelming. As the final boss fight for the whole thing, I kind of wish there was more to it. Even the map barely has anything between fights apart from one moment with jumping potions. It's time for Sticky Thorns in E4M06 Spikes and Spiders. This is another one that can get a bit devious with enemies spawning in on all sides suddenly, so you'd better either shoot fast or get out fast. It's technically non-linear, but the optimal path is definitely going up to down since you'll grab the keys and have the least amount of backtracking. There isn't too much variation, it's mostly switch platforms, spikes, and lava, which have become more than standard by this point. You won't find any clever use of morph potions, paths scriptedly opening and closing, or destructible blocks here. It's pretty basic. That doesn't mean it's bad, of course, but it does mean it overall feels like another paint-by-numbers map to get through. Alright, but not exactly noteworthy. It's time to get swapped all around in E1M08 Switch'a'Moon. I'll give it credit, the idea of using a morph potion over a path to access said path later is interesting. Other than that, though, we're understandably starting to reach the point where it's played its hand and doesn't have as much unique. It seems the designer couldn't think of a way to free you from the final area. The wizard warns you about required crystal balls. It feels a bit more linear than previous maps, as the one diverging path has locked doors to stop you in your tracks. Maybe it's to be expected, but these past two maps have felt less special, a little more predictable. It's time to weep like the Lorax in E2M07 Wallowing Willows. For the most part, despite the interesting new aesthetics and the planned projectile flowers, this map doesn't really impress with its relative linearity, at least if you don't like backtracking. The most interesting thing about the map is there are 4 hidden switches you have to press to access a silver key, which gives you a secret treasure room. Technically, there seems to be branching paths, but one of them is to a mandatory golden key, so I don't consider it much of a choice. If anything, having to go all the way back if you didn't know about it and pick the wrong path is a little annoying, especially with all the platforming over spikes and lava. Ultimately, it has a nice aesthetic and a pretty interesting secret room, but the lack of any meaningful paths apart from that make the map more like a guessing game if you want to play optimally. It's time for the frights of yesteryear in E1M07 Ancient Dreads. As one of the theme changes, this one is mostly overwhelming, though that may be chalked up to the fact that it's near the end of the game. If nothing else, the dragon platforms look pretty cool, even if the enemies don't look all that different from previously shown enemies. To the map's credit, it at least has some mild combo switches to mix things up. They're pretty easy, but they stall you for a second. An inescapable lava pit is just downright evil, though, for a game that doesn't have saves except for the beginning of the map. Overall, it's another map I can say is competent, but at this point in the game, it seems consistently maps that just aren't impressing me. It's time to face the robed jerks in E1M09 Loathsome 7. The main gimmick of this map is 7 powerful monks you're supposed to beat, but they're not that fun to face. Their attacks seem random. I had better results parking myself in front of them and hammering the fire button. Now, one thing I like is there's 5 morph potions and 4 of them take you above spikes. That's at least different. I wasn't too impressed by the monks, to be honest, though I will say it's at least interesting having boss enemies. Ultimately, though, I feel it could have been more than just rapidly firing and playing a guessing game, but it's still not too bad. It's time to mutually assured destruction in E4M4 Scorpion's Tail. In some ways, this map feels a bit like filler to stretch out the episode, in that it's not bad by any means, but it also doesn't have too much going for it. At least one interesting thing is there's 2 lifts on alternate sides of you, so you can go around the loop clockwise or counterclockwise. Always nice to see some non-linearity. Another sort of nifty thing the wizard points out is the only health potions that exist on the map is through a secret morph potion. Another kind of interesting thing is a jump potion to get an optional key, but it's just a bit of treasure, so don't expect to be wowed by managing to get it. Ultimately, it feels like a map that was made to fill out the roster rather than to necessarily incorporate any exciting new ideas. It's time to go rolling into E1M01 Tripping On In. As expected, it's a pretty basic first map, though it does introduce a number of things like both side and above projectiles and lava. Even a secret area that the snarky wizard who loves telling you how you stand no chance alludes to, offering you some incentive for looking around a little. It's pretty simple too. Rather than look for an exit or defeat some boss, you just find all the crystal balls to move on to the next map. Aesthetically, it looks very interesting with the shrooms in the background and skulls lining the walls for a sense of foreboding. All in all, pretty good starter map to get you prepared for what's to come. It's time to decay into plants in E2M08 Forest of Rott. You know, it honestly baffles me why so many of these maps feel the need to be so linear when the whole point is collecting all the crystal balls. This is another case where due to locked doors, any branching paths is really the illusion of freedom since you'll have to backtrack to keys. I'd much rather it be a find things in any order kind of thing. You can still have that while having locked doors, maybe just one crystal ball behind one locked door. The map is fine, having a pretty satisfying trek of rapid-firing platforms near the beginning, but it's genuinely a pet peeve of mine when maps and games feel too much like a straight line. It's still a decent map aesthetically and all that, but it leaves a bit to be desired in terms of overall depth, and thinking about it, those flower enemies are basically weaker monks too. It's time to get to shelter fast because there be dragons in E3M9. I'll give it a little credit, the dragons are mostly like the monks, but at least they lower their head as a warning and have more interesting patterns. The map design definitely doesn't have that much going for it, it's mostly lifts and platforms, nothing interesting like with the trees. You do get rapid fire for all of them, however, so it never takes you too long to actually take them down. Aesthetically, dragons are always cool, so that's another point in their favor of the monks, if nothing else. As a boss map, it's overall not the worst, but it's definitely not the best either. It would have been cool if there was more to them. It's time to plunge into the depths in E3M4 Going Downfall. So unfortunately, this map seems to be going away from the more open design in favor of linearity. While you get maybe 1 or 2 branching paths, it's mostly a fixed path until you get through most of the map. Now, I will give the map credit for some cleverness, like a visible lift you have to loop around on to actually unlock. However, I'd prefer it use these kinds of concepts in a map that more encouraged open exploration. Despite that, it's still a decent map with decent use of earlier enemies and certainly isn't bad. It's time to get scarred red in E1M2 Devil's Claw. For the most part, this map is much the same as the first one, same enemies and hazards. It does switch things up somewhat, like having more platforming and over spikes. To some extent, it's exploratory, and this time the secret isn't quite as obvious. For the most part, though, it's reiterating on what the first map introduced and progressing it a bit. The wizard is even there, hinting on the secret, not insulting you this time around. Overall, it's not the most original map out there, but it adds enough to make it more interesting overall. It's time to pray for calcium in E4M05 Skull Sanctuary. As expected, it's another change of aesthetics, with this one changing to spiders and snakes and to a different type of bolt-firing demons than before. Probably the most interesting part of the map is having a lift blocking you and you need to get the silver key to get to the other side of it. Not too many branching paths, but here or there you can choose one of two things to get first, so at least it has that. It also relegates health potions to one area, but it's not a secret this time. The actual secret is just treasure as they traditionally are. It's a pretty decent map overall, nothing earth-shattering, but it's got a new coat of paint and a unique way of key locking. It's time to face death itself in E4M1 Final Destination. The wizard makes it clear that this would be a more challenging map. It has virtually no health potions. Mind you, it's not too hard because you still get a generous amount of power-ups like rapid fire to hit them back with. The map technically has choices of floors, but they're less complex and mostly boil down to left or right first. There's very much a path you have to go through and you're generally better off just taking each branch as they come. Pretty decent map, but the lack of health potions means you have to be careful. I'd have liked a bit more meat to it. It's time to get mean-looked in E3M06 Faces of Evo. This one is sort of okay, still sectioning massive chunks off via silver and gold key, but there's a few choices along the way. It's got a few rapid fires for that good old blasting through crowds of foes fun, as well as the now very expected hops over lava and beds of spikes. Interestingly, there's something that appeared to be a dead end, but with a visible key and switch behind blocks, enticing you to look for the way in. Other than that, there isn't really anything new here, but that's to be expected when you're mostly through the third episode into the game, so it's fine. Ultimately, it's another map that probably isn't going to wow you and could be better in some regards, but it's well enough made that I can say it was fun going through. It's time to sink into the dreaded liquids in E4M08 at Death's Moat. I'll give it credit, being a gauntlet is the most unique, but at least it's different, and a penultimate map of the whole thing should be a bit tough. Saving the keys for last gets the best difficulty curve, since naturally the hardest horde is behind the silver door to the gold key. This map, more than any of the others, feels like a shooting gallery with the abundance of power-ups to deal with those many hordes of enemies. At least it certainly wasn't boring. I even nearly lost my health the first time going through it, and I played through the game on medium. As the last regular map of the game, it proves its mettle in being tough, even if it still isn't exactly revolutionizing in the gameplay mechanics department. This tree's bark is worse than its bite in E2M9 Biting Bark Guardians. The nicest thing I could probably say about this map is the tree demons are somewhat more interesting than the monks. Instead of sitting back pelting you with energy, they roam around simply trying to get you with the instant death flag the bosses all seem to have. Thankfully, they're not too repetitive taken down, since all of them after the first one have rapid fire potions nearby, and one interestingly incorporates the jumping potion too. It's still linear, of course, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but at least it serves as a much better boss that's both easy if you know what to do, but all too easy to slip up and die. Guess you can say it's similar to the Cyber Demon on Doom in that regard, and that gives it a bit of an exciting edge over the monks that felt like a chore getting through. It's time to pick up the pieces in E2M1, the Shattered and the Sorry. For being the starter of the second episode, it's a pretty decent warm-up, literally due to all the fire. Hocus Pocus seems to like primate-like enemies because there's a new one here in addition to serpents. It's a relatively short map, just 5 crystal balls, but has things like combo switches and rapid fire, which are always nice. The only weird thing is platforms whose steps are destructible, so you might end up having to jump. Overall, it's a good starter map with a good amount of exploration and, as the wizard points out, decent bit of challenge. It's time to watch our heads in E4M2 Dragon's Descent. I'll give this map credit, it makes an interesting new use of lifts where it's 2 layers and you need to get through both sides. It's also decently non-linear, just requiring a key to get to the second half of the map, so I'm pretty happy on that. I noticed smart bombs are back in addition to the expected fireball and rapid fire power-ups to give you more of a fighting chance. This map also follows the trend of the previous one by having no health potions. I'm wondering if that'll apply to the whole episode. As a whole, it's a good map with an interesting twist on lifts and continues to be pretty challenging too. It's time to get the illusion of greatness in E2M06 Egyptian Mirage. This is another pretty decent map, interestingly having the first optional key you could easily miss. It involves a jump potion you can only use once, so you better figure out you're supposed to grab the key. There's also another secret, naturally triggered via a morph potion at the end of spikes. While there's only one path you're encouraged to take to get everything, it's surprisingly non-linear. I wouldn't quite put it up to the level of the previous map, but it's still surprisingly good in its own right. It's time to get False Hope in E1M07 Oasis of the Wicked. For some reason, these new enemies feel even tougher than usual, fitting that they're now themed after dinosaurs. Those pterodactyls chucking rocks at you for some reason seem like they attack a lot faster than the devils do, so it can be difficult to escape damage without sighting them. The map as a whole is pretty good, though I'm confused why the wizard asked about remembering health potions unless he meant for the locked door at the beginning. Either way, this map at least surprised me with the new cast of enemies proving more difficult than expected, so that's a plus. Ultimately, the map design still isn't anything too major, but this game clearly still has some tricks up its sleeve. Pleasant surprise, that one! It's time to dodge perilous vines in E1M05 Forest of Nightmares. This one is reasonably open-ended in that the map is basically cut in half by a gold door, but other than that you have choices via lifts. It also introduces some new enemies, a rather new aesthetic via ghosts and skeletons that work well with the bats to make more of a Halloween theme. It also goes somewhat back to basics with only the rapid fire as a power-up, but hey, that's all you really need to take care of just about anything in your path. Actually has one pretty clever secret where if you just indiscriminately shoot the destructible blocks without focusing on the upper ones, you lose your chance to get some treasure. Overall, it's a nice introduction to a new set of enemies and is another pretty solid map. Not great, but nothing I can genuinely complain about either. It's time to flock like crows in E1M03 Shining Curses. For the positives, it goes back to the Egyptian theme, which I love, and there's health potions again. For the cons, it's technically non-linear, but in the sense that one path will waste your time due to a locked door. Probably the most unique part of the map is a couple of pyramids with treasure and morph potions leading back out, a bit shallow, but it's pretty cool. At least it still retains the lifts that have become commonplace, which is still nice for giving more options of rooms. Ultimately, it's a decent map with a familiar aesthetic I love, and it merges it well enough with the more newly introduced mechanics. It's time to enjoy oversized drumsticks and cactus cola in E1M08 Prehistoric Paradise. This is another decent map. I can't tell if it's more forgiving or I'm just more used to the dinosaurs because I had a much easier time with this map. The most unique part of the map is one where destructible blocks pop up behind you on a small hall to a key. It's neat, but it's not exactly mind-blowing. Still sections off chunks behind keys, but you have enough choices of floors that I wouldn't really call linear. It's open enough for my liking. The wizard wisely tells you not to rush this map because some dinosaurs are very tricky about the way they'll spawn behind you, forcing you back. Ultimately, it serves well enough as the penultimate map to the third episode of the game and gets just trickier with enemies spawning to keep you on your toes and force you to be careful. It's time for Twisted Bizarreness in E1M01, the Warped, Weary, and Weird. Interestingly, this map adds elevators, which is kind of funny that it took this long to give us something like that, given it allows far more verticality. This is a pretty good one since you actually get some degree of choice, minus having to get a silver and gold key to access those areas. As expected, it retains power-ups from previous maps, namely Rapid Fire and the Triple Fireball, although it also reuses previous enemies, not that that's an issue. The map is mostly as you'd expect with a few secrets, but it's amazing just how much versatility that elevators add, which alone gives it a fresh feeling. Overall, it's a pretty good starter to the episode. It's good to know this game still has a few tricks up its sleeve so it doesn't start growing stale. It's time to feel the sharp cold in E1M06 Ice Shank. It's following the trend of having a follow-up to the theme, and it feels like an escalated take. You've got somewhat leaps of faith, including interestingly a morph potion to a secret treasure room. Wasn't the biggest fan of spears thrown off screen, but they're not the fastest projectiles, so it's fine. That's how I describe the map as a whole, really. It's perfectly fine, but it won't blow you away. That's not to say it isn't perfectly serviceable, though. It's another fine map, and the ice theme is pretty. It's time to feel ruby-studded chills in E1M02 Ghastly Garnet. This is another decent map that makes extensive use of lifts, suggesting they're going to be pretty prominent in this episode, which I'm all for. Also of note is there's one seriously massive treasure room, making use of jumping potions to make it to treasure and ledges above if you don't waste them. This is also another map that needs 2 keys, but is otherwise decent about giving you options where to go around grabbing the crystal balls. It has a pretty nice aesthetic too, with an overall colorful gems look, which adds to the appeal of the map in my opinion. Overall, it's another good map and is a good sign of things to come for the episode. Here's hoping it stays on that course. It's time to ascend beyond the flesh in E1M03 Uplifting Crossbones. So far, it looks like the third episode's gonna be a real winner because this is another solid map. This map adds a new mechanism in the form of a smart bomb that moves around and destroys all visible enemies if you hit it. The maker of this map must also like large spaces because this one room is massive in addition to a fairly big secret room. Seems to be following a pattern where you have to get 2 keys to completely get the crystal balls. Thankfully, it also follows the pattern of being quite good. This is turning out to be a banger episode so far. It's time to pay for our greed in E2M05 Golden Sandstorm. I must say, this map is so much better than the previous 2 when it comes to the linearity department. It actually branches out somewhat in the search. It also has an aesthetically nice new theme. A pyramid full of mummies and bats fit pretty nicely with the Egyptian walls and gold blocks. I also like the secret treasure room. It's hidden a bit more cleverly than many previous secrets, so it feels rewarding. There's even a pretty cool power-up that gives you 3 fireballs. They basically decimate all enemies directly in front of it in a straight line. All in all, I'd say this map is a complete breath of fresh air compared to the ones before it. I was actually getting worried that they'd all become stale by this point. It's time to feel the inner fire in E1M04 Enflamed Impalement. At first glance, this looks much like Devil's Claw, where it's only building in the previous map. However, it does introduce a pretty fun power-up that makes your magic rapid fire. It's actually pretty fun mowing down a large group of enemies that were placed there for it. There's also a crystal ball at the end of a spiked floor. Don't know how to feel about it, but it's different at least. All around, another good map, and the rapid fire is fun to play with, but I don't know if I'd call it my favorite. It's time to get the ultimate freezer burn in E1M05 Hellfrost. In following the previous maps, this one's a completely different theme again. This time it's an Arctic theme with spear-throwing dwellers and melee penguins. It also kind of introduces a special potion that turns you into a ball and just whisks you somewhere. My one criticism is it's a touch more linear than previous maps, though still has a branching path. One nice thing though is switches to open shortcuts back to the previous spot if you missed something. Overall, it's a good map with a nice chill aesthetic. It's time to shape out the shrubbery in E1M03 Forest Marble. Proving that Hocus Pocus isn't content to be the same types of maps, this one switches it up. Now the enemies are a primate-like close-range enemy and a flying one shooting sideways. It also introduces a combination switch a la Duke 3D along with a unique aesthetic. Interestingly, one crystal ball at the end of a line lets you pull a switch to get out in case it's not the last one. Overall, it's a nice change of pace, and it's good to see the game introduce more things. It's time to overview our young wizard's progress. It may not seem like it with how many of these maps left me overwhelmed, but I absolutely love this game in terms of its gameplay and style. If anything, I feel far too many of the maps underutilize the mechanics of the game, such as the morph potions mostly relegated to secrets here and there, for example. It showcases some sliver of that potential, what could be done, but it seems it's mostly content to be rapid-fire shooting galleries as you head from floor to floor. The boss fights were on the underwhelming side, with tree demons that try to ray me for an instant kill being the only one I'd say was truly interesting. Still a very fun game, and I'd recommend trying it at least once, but it'd be nice to see more care placed into its maps as a whole. It'll certainly test your trigger finger, given you'll be very pushed into mashing it as fast as you can to clear those enemies fast.